Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope you can wave if you can hear me? Excellent, excellent. That's very good. We had really quite considerable technical problems this morning, and I'm without my great IT advisor this evening, so I really do hope that everything's going to work perfectly happily. In a moment, I'm going to start screen sharing with you, and that's where some of the problems arose this morning. So I hope that we won't have the same problem. It's very lovely to see names and to see faces coming up. This lecture is going to be recorded, and it will go up on the website, so you should be able to access it later if for whatever reason you want to leave or anything. Now I'm going to do something very, very brave, and I'm going to try and screen share. And I hope you've now got a full screen. Has the screen share worked, people who are here? Yes, oh good, I'm seeing some people nodding, excellent. This is where we had problems this morning, so I'm just going to test something. Oh, Someone's written, yes, good screen share, but I'm not certain it's working. I think we're running into the same problem we had this morning. If I shared it on full screen, I couldn't get it to move. Oh, this is so frustrating. I've tested it this afternoon with just one other person, and it worked perfectly happily. But now it won't. You've got a few minutes, so let's. This is frustrating. I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment and see if I can sort this out. Now I'm going to go back, everybody, to see if I can screen share again. If I screen share like that, are you able to see it reasonably well, please? Can some people sort of tell me if you're able to see it?
I can see it, Vanessa.
Have I got, who am I speaking? Who's that speaking?
Phil Smith speaking.
Brilliant, you can see that.
Yeah.
Can other people see it? I'm sorry about this. This is proving very, very, very frustrating. Because I think I'm going to have to end up doing what I did this morning, which is just scrolling down like this, which is not what's meant to happen. Never mind. Right, we'll go back to the first screen. At least I can get that to work. We've got a good lot of people joining us this evening, which is very lovely. I hope you've all managed to have something to eat or drink. I will probably end up sipping some coffee in the course of this evening. Something is already, though, working very much better than it did this morning. I can actually see some faces. I found myself this morning having to speak just to an almost blank screen, which I found pretty near impossible. We'll wait just a couple of minutes and begin on time. One or two people are still joining us. Welcome if you've just joined us in the last few minutes. like counting down before, I don't know, the start of some almighty takeoff, watching the clock tick by. I'll begin at exactly at 7:30. Right, it's 7:30, so I'm going to begin. First of all, can I say welcome to everyone? Thank you very much for joining us this evening in the first of these 6 lectures. Despite some technical problems, I hope it's going to be an enjoyable time this evening. It's going to be a very, in a sense, quick romp through quite a lot of theology and history this evening. This is going to be a sort of much lighter introduction. Some of our later sessions, I'm actually going to send you some things to read in advance if you want. And also we will pause in the next lecture at various points for you to be able to interact a little bit. But for this first lecture, we decided not to do that. I hope that, sort of having read the publicity that was put out by the cathedral, you don't feel at the end of the session that this, as it were, has not met the objectives. But the whole point of this course is actually just simply to be able to give people who don't really have a deep knowledge of the history and the spirituality of the Church of England an overview of how the theology and the spirituality and some of the practices of the Church of England have developed down the years. I apologize to those of you who are historians. If you know anything about the history of the medieval church, you're probably going to find a lot of this sort of, in a sense, quite derivative and really quite basic. But I'm aware that for very many people, this is new. I'm conscious, for instance, that in the Church of England, more than 70% of people coming forward to a bishop's advisory panel for ordination in the Church of England have actually come from a nonconformist background. That figure, that percentage might well surprise people here, but it's true. And one of the reasons, therefore, for this course is to give people of whatever background a good oversight of the heritage that we have. I've called it The Weight of Glory, which is a title I've stolen from C.S. Lewis. But in front of you, you've got a slide which reads, "Of godly intent and purpose devised." And that is, in fact, a phrase that comes from Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the Reformer. And that might surprise you because, in fact, when he wrote that phrase, he was referring to medieval church practices. As a reformer, Cranmer was both concerned to bring about change in the church in England, but at the same time, he was also deeply concerned for continuity. And that's a theme that I hope is going to run through these evenings together, that of change and continuity. We very often think of the Reformation as throwing over a huge amount of what had gone before, and in part that's true. But there are also elements that are very real continuity, and I hope these come out as we go through the next few Monday evenings together. And we want to ask the question, how have we got to the situation in the Church of England with the different traditions that we have at the moment? How come is it, for instance, that in the Church of England, you can go to a church like St. Peter's in Brighton, and there is a large community of people worshipping in a very free, easy, modern style. There aren't very many seats at St. Peter's Brighton, something the medieval churchgoers would have understood. And in the same denomination, there we have Walsingham. something totally different. This, in fact, is a slide taken of my old parish church, where until 4 weeks ago, I was the associate vicar, what I might call a perfectly traditional, semi-rural parish church, robed choir, Eucharist on a Sunday. I now find myself in a situation akin to this at a cathedral. So where have these traditions come from? And how is it that they are tolerated and actually revered so much in the Church of England today? That's one of the questions I hope over the next few weeks we will explore. We do begin, though, we need to just take note of one or two technical issues before we begin. And the first is that of historiography. In other words, changing methods of interpreting the evidence we have for beliefs and practices in the late medieval church. There are some questions to be answered and some things to be aware of. I'm going to refer to religion as it was practiced in the late medieval church as traditional religion, which is a phrase that's been used by historians like Dermot McCulloch and Eamon Duffy, rather than Roman Catholic religion, because in fact they didn't think of themselves at that time, of course, as being Roman Catholic, thought of themselves as being Catholic. But we're going to refer to traditional religion. And the question comes, and has been around for a long time, as to what was the state of that traditional religion. When I was at school, which I admit is pretty well ancient history nowadays, I was taught to a large extent that traditional religion in the 15th century was in decline. I was introduced at the end of my studies to the work of people like G.R. Elton and, in fact, A.G. Dickens, who were beginning to argue differently. But some of you might have grown up with the idea that religion in the 15th century in England was declining. Recent research has shown that not to be the case. It wasn't in decline at all, whether we're looking at things like wills or at restoration building projects in churches, the pattern of book buying and other things. It would appear that traditional religion in many ways was very much alive and was much loved by people. The question has also come as to whether or not the Reformation, when it occurred, and very obviously it occurs over a period of time, and we will look over the next few weeks exactly what we mean by it, is whether actually it was a movement from above or from below. Historians like A.G. Dickens have argued that there was a legacy in England from Lollardy in the 14th, early 15th century, which actually stayed alive, and it created as it were, sort of fertile soil in which later Lutheran ideas were to flourish. Other historians like G.R. Elton have argued no, Reformation when it came was very much imposed from above, particularly in the 1530s by Thomas Cromwell. Tudor England was undoubtedly very well governed, but again, recent research has shown huge variations in this and different local variations. And we need always to be aware of our sources, where have they come from, who has written them, and who has interpreted them. So that's just by way of introduction. What I'm going to do now is begin by looking at some medieval buildings, and I'm going to take us right back to the very beginning. Here is a photograph of St. Mary Magdalene, Leominster, which I hope you can see. I hope if you want to move the images around, you know how to do that. This is the church where until 4 weeks ago I was vicar. And as the village name suggests, this was a minster church. It's an absolutely immense Anglo-Saxon barn of a church. Christianity came to England probably with the Roman army, with traders under the Roman period. Christianity was recognized as a religion within the Roman Empire in 313 by Constantine. And in 314, 3 English bishops attended the Council of Arles, the Bishop of London, the Bishop of York, and probably the Bishop of Lincoln. So the Christian church in England was established and had some governance by that date. The Anglo-Saxon invasions followed, of course, and with the Anglo-Saxon invasions came the demise of Christianity in many parts of the country, although in certain areas it survived and certain cults survived, like the cult of St. Albans, and Christianity survived in the southeast and southwest rather, and over in Wales. We're familiar with dates like 597 when Augustine's mission came to England, and as I'm here in Chichester, Wilfrid came to Sussex about 681 and founded his church at Selsey. So Christianity was re-established, as it were, at the end of the 6th century, the beginning of the 7th century in England. And to begin with, the pattern of religion and religious expansion in England was based from what can loosely be called monastic foundations. The Latin for a monastery is monasterium, and that sort of was corrupted into English as a minster. And between about 600 and 900, we can envisage Christianity in England, as it were, being based from these minster churches. They didn't necessarily look like the monasteries that we're used to in the sort of high Middle Ages. They weren't necessarily particularly enclosed. We know, for instance, from Bede's accounts that Cuthbert left his sort of monastery. He traveled round northern England as an evangelist, preaching, baptizing, hearing confessions. And that is very much the pattern of the Minster, the Minster churches. They were staffed by religious communities, but they were very, very varied. And historians reckon that there were about 300 to 400 Minster churches in England. There would be priests or a priest at a Minster church, and so Mass would be said every Sunday, and the offices, the daily worship of God would be offered day by day. Gradually, though, the Minster churches began to change, and we begin to see from 900 onwards the proliferation of more individual churches, field churches, churches associated with lords of the manor, as they were later known. Villages begin to emerge, and parish churches, as we know them now, become more common. As these churches were built, they required land in order to actually sort of provide an income for the clergy who were there. Graveyards developed around them, and as they needed income, they needed land, and so the areas, as it were, overseen by a priest with the cure of souls in a church, those boundaries for those areas became established and became known as parishes. And by the 12th century, the parish boundaries were fairly well fixed. And we saw the Christianization, what's often called the Christianization of the landscape. In the little bit of Sussex where I used to work, there were not only parish churches, there were numerous chapels by fords over the Arun, chapels by causeways. In my parish, there were the remains of no fewer than 4 religious houses. Leominster itself became a convent, probably in the late Anglo-Saxon era, and then in the High Middle Ages as well. It became a Benedictine convent. So, and guild churches were established from the 12th century onwards. So it became a very, very, very Christian landscape. What could you expect to find inside a medieval church? Well, here I think many of us are in for a surprise. I chose this image deliberately because this is the facade of Wells Cathedral. And there on the right is Wells as we know it now, fairly austere, grey. It's difficult to make out the sort of 300 plus images of saints and other figures on that facade. It's absolutely gorgeous even now. But to the left is an artist's representation of recent research, which shows how very possibly how it looked in the Middle Ages when it was painted. And I think for most of us, that's quite a shock. It's very, very gaudy. Added to which, at the top of the very first tier of arcades and statues. In fact, you can't see it at all from these pictures, but there are actually holes in the facade, and there were passages behind these holes, and at various great festivals, particularly Palm Sunday, the choir at Wells Cathedral would stand behind these holes, and as the congregation gathered on the lawn in front of the cathedral, waiting for the processions, so the choir would sing, and their voices would have been magnified by these particular choir hills, and it would have seemed as if the entire facade had come to life. The saints, the angels were singing. Medieval churches were colourful. Some of us are used to seeing paintings inside churches. Here's a little bit of a painting from Easby in North Yorkshire depicting the expulsion from the garden. But the medieval wall paintings as we know them have faded. They would of course have been much, much more vivid in colour. Medieval churches weren't whitewashed. They were places of colour. And they were also places where that were subdivided. Subdivisions occurred ever increasingly during the Middle Ages. Early churches took the form of Roman basilicas, so simple sort of cells with a round east end, modelled on a Roman assembly hall or judgment hall basilica. But throughout the Middle Ages, they were subdivided. In England, we developed the characteristic square east end for various reasons, which are still slightly disputed by the architectural historians. And what you see in front of you is what's known as a rood screen. It's a modern one, actually, at the church in Dorchester in Oxfordshire. But rood screens were erected in parish churches in the 13th century. Some of them existed beforehand, and in fact the archetype for the rood, which is actually, the rood is the name given to the statue, that statue of Jesus Christ crucified on the top of the rood screen. It's an Anglo-Saxon word meaning crucifixion. Actually, the archetype of that comes from Charlemagne's chapel at Aachen. But they were put up in the early 13th century and formed a division between the chancel and the sanctuary and the nave where the congregation was. They began the demarcation of the parish church into areas for the laity, for the common people, for want of a better word, and for the clergy. The impetus in 1215 was the Fourth Lateran Council, which asked that the reserved sacrament should be in a place where it would be kept safe, where it couldn't be damaged. And as churches were used by the communities and sometimes for things, for social events in effect, they could be quite rowdy. There was a concern that the sacrament should be kept safe, and rood screens were one way of doing it. At the bottom of the screen, there was a solid partition, was very often painted with saints, very often local saints. Then there's the open section so that the congregation in the nave could see through as the priest would celebrate mass, standing there at the high altar, and they needed to be able to see the elevation of the host. And then on the top of the screen is what's known as the rood beam. They were often very wide enough on occasions, many occasions in fact, to house a medieval altar, for candles to be put there, and to support the rood itself, that crucifixion, that statue of the crucifixion of Jesus, always supported by Mary, his mother, on one side, and St. John the Evangelist. But there are subdivisions elsewhere in the medieval church as more and more side altars and side chapels were erected, in part to do with the veneration of the saints and also with the growth of chantry chapels. So a medieval church was quite a complex area, subdivided into areas where the clergy could go, where the laity were allowed, and colourful. But who were the people in the medieval church? Well, we have to start off first and foremost with the priest. And there in front of you is an image from a missal, from a manuscript of a priest celebrating Mass in front of the altar. It's actually quite a late manuscript, but it's quite clear, which is why I chose it. There's the priest. He's actually looking up at probably a vision of the Virgin Mary, which we'll come on to later. At his side is a deacon kneeling to assist him in the Mass. And every parish church would have its priest who would have the cure of souls, as it was called, for those people who lived within the parish. But his major role, and of course they were only men, was to say the Mass, both on Sundays, at the principal service on Sunday, although it might be said at other times on a Sunday, and to say Mass on festival days. He would also say other services during the day. The priest here is vested. He's wearing special robes, which in fact come from very ancient patterns. They're derived in many cases from ordinary everyday Roman wear, but they became special liturgical garments denoting the dignity and the sanctity of the priest. They disappeared for the most part at the Reformation and didn't reappear in the Church of England until the 19th century. And we will look at what priests or ministers, presbyters wore after the Reformation in a later lecture. But the priest who was there to celebrate the Mass and to hold the cure of souls for the parish also held the benefice. In other words, he held the rights to the revenues, the tithes, etc., that supported the parish church. In many cases, of course, the revenues from the parish church were taken over appropriated by another organisation, be it a religious house or a lord or somebody or other. It becomes quite complicated. And if the benefice was held by another institution, then they would have to appoint a vicar in their place or a curate to be in the parish church, and they would receive a certain portion of the benefice, of the rights and the revenues for the benefice. In many cases, it wasn't very much. The question many people ask is actually, how did somebody become a priest in the Middle Ages? Especially as many of us are aware that standards of education in the Middle Ages varied hugely, and standards of education for priests really went hand in hand with education that was available for the laity. In order to become a priest, you had to be ordained by a bishop, generally in one of the Ember weeks, 4 times during the year. And a man becoming a priest would have been received earlier into what are known as the minor orders of deacon and subdeacon. There were other clerical orders, the major orders of deacon and subdeacon. There were other orders that were known as the minor orders, and these were the tonsured boys and the acolytes. It was possible to be tonsured and be placed in minor orders, in fact, from the age of 7. And to become an acolyte, someone held the candles in the services, and they had a vital role in the medieval liturgy from the age of 14. But if you were tonsured, if you didn't become or you became an acolyte, it didn't mean that you were necessarily going to go on and be ordained into major orders. The whole idea was that a man seeking to become a priest would be examined as to whether he was suitable by the archdeacon. He had to be of legitimate birth. He couldn't be illegitimate. He needed to be free, not a serf. And also, ideally, he shouldn't have been impaired physically by any injury or disease, although there were ways and licenses of getting around all that. And at the very least, he needed to be able to pronounce and to sing the Latin liturgy and to sing the plain song. And I stress pronounce rather than understand, because it wasn't necessarily the case that priests understood the Latin, but they needed to be able to pronounce it. Education and literacy, obviously, were very, very variable, depending on place and depending on wealth in the Middle Ages. The ability to be able to pronounce basic Latin could often be taught in a local school. A church I know well is that of St Mary's, Harrow on the Hill. And there was a schoolroom above the porch, certainly from the 14th century. And probably there, boys were taught by the parish priest or the parish clerk just simply to be able to pronounce Latin and to learn some of it by rote. To understand it probably meant attending a grammar school, and they were fewer and farther apart and required fees, so only the wealthy could go to them. There's a very famous visitation of Sonning Parish in 1222, when it was found that of 7 of the priests there, only one could understand the Latin of the liturgy, and the others were deemed to be gravely deficient. And education of the clergy and standards of the clergy was something really concerned people through the Middle Ages, and there were endless visitations and attempts to increase the education of the clergy. But we do need to be slightly careful, because lack of education didn't mean of necessity that a priest wasn't liked and wasn't well regarded by his parish. John Merck, writing slightly unknown dates, but let's say around 1400 for just a date pinholed on, actually wrote that a priest of simple literacy, but with a humble heart and well governed, is dear to God, reminding us that despite the fact that many of these men were ill-educated, they were often conscientious men, and many of them dearly loved. Which is not to say there weren't priests who weren't like that. And there is another manuscript showing a priest in the Mass. He is holding up the host high above his head so that it can be seen by the people. And this would have taken place at the moment of consecration. There is an acolyte as well, holding tapers, so that he can be seen, the tapers as well, symbolizing the glory of what has just taken place. The priest is again wearing vestments, and you can see the altar. He's standing eastward facing, and there on the altar in front of him is a missal, is a mass book, and liturgical vessels, and yet more tapers on the altar. He's standing facing east. Eastward facing is important because it's the direction, it indicates sort of facing the direction in which Christ will come at the last judgment. That's picking up on that biblical imagery of Christ coming like the sun and rising in the east, but judgment coming from the east. And it also symbolizes the priest standing in the same direction as the laity. For the reformers, the priest in this direction, facing in this direction, was so very obviously a barrier between the people and God. But actually, you can look at it from another point of view and see this as a priest standing there as representative of the people, offering, but also God's representative, being a bridge between the laity and the divine, offering the sacrifice of the Mass on behalf of the people. I've said that the Mass was really the most important function of a priest. And questions arise as to what form did the Mass take? Well, there were considerable variations on the Mass in the early Middle Ages in England, although the basic form had been well established from the 2nd, 3rd century. But there were local variations. And in England, 3 forms particularly predominated, associated with the cathedrals of Hereford, York, and Salisbury, the rites of Hereford, York, and Sarum. And actually, it was the rite of Sarum that really, by the 13th century, became best established in England and was the Mass that was certainly in most common use by the end of the Middle Ages. What about beliefs of what was happening at the Mass? Well, the belief in the very real presence of Christ in the elements, in the bread and the wine. The bit of bread that the priest is holding up there is known as the host. That's coming from the Latin hostia, meaning a victim. The basic belief was that of transubstantiation. It had long been held, although it wasn't actually stipulated as dogma until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. But the belief that Christ was truly, really present in the elements of the Mass had been there for a long time. Thomas Aquinas provided the Aristotelian framework for understanding transubstantiation. The Aristotelian framework is the idea that any object has both an accident and outward appearance and substance, an inward reality. And for Thomas Aquinas, the accident, the outward appearance of the bread and the wine remained the same. But in the Mass, at the prayer of consecration, as the host was elevated, as the chalice was elevated, its substance, its real inner reality, became the body and the blood of Christ. As it were, the substance was transferred, hence the term transubstantiation. And the Mass was seen as being quite literally vital. Quoting from Eamon Duffy at this point, he describes the Mass for men and women in the, let's say, the 15th century as representing the redemption of the world wrought on Good Friday once for all. And in the Mass, this was renewed and made fruitful for all who believed. Christ himself became present on the altar of the parish church. His blood flowed again to nourish and renew the church and the world. Medieval belief about the Mass saw Christ's death on the cross, that Good Friday, as being a death once for all. But Eamon Duffy sort of, I think, words it beautifully when he says it's renewed, it's remembered, it's reenacted, but so much more than that. It's renewed and made fruitful for all who believe. He is truly present there on the altar of the parish church, and his blood flowed again. The host was elevated above, at the prayer of consecration. The priest would elevate the host above his head so that people could see it. And this was necessary, of course, for a variety of reasons. First of all, the Mass, as we've already said, was in Latin. And the people may not have understood exactly what was happening. So they needed to know when the crucial event took place. And that was made visible for them by the priest raising the host high above his head. And even with a rood screen, it could be seen. And in case you'd missed it, either because you were distracted or you were absorbed in your own prayers, a bell was rung at that key moment. The host was elevated because, in fact, this was the element in the Mass that mattered the most to the lay people. It would be the element in which they shared on the rare occasions in which they actually took communion themselves. The chalice was also elevated by the priest, but only up to his chest. So the Mass was said in Latin, but also the practice had grown up of large portions of the Mass, in fact, being said silently by the priest, the so-called secret of the Mass. This coincided in places where churches where people sung, where there was music, they would be singing over these sections of the Mass, but that wouldn't necessarily take place in the ordinary parish church. But seeing the host became an absolute focal point of the Mass. And in fact, at the elevation as well, torches and more candles were lit at the altar, and they were kept alight from the elevation to the Agnus Dei to emphasize the idea that this is the most sacred part of the Mass. Christ has been made truly present, and there in the host, the glory of God can be seen. A lot of this was to change. The theology of a lot of this obviously became contentious at the Reformation. But much of the wording of the Rite of Sarum, that order of the Mass associated with Salisbury Cathedral, in fact, came over into the Reformed Church of England. And I don't know whether you can see that clearly, but I'll read it to you. This is an English translation of one of the prayers of preparation said by a priest before the Mass in the Sarum Rite. God, unto whom all hearts be open, and unto whom all wealth speaketh, and unto whom no privy thing is hid, I beseech thee for to cleanse the intent of my heart with the unspeakable gift of the Holy Ghost, that I may perfectly love and worthily praise thee, and also that hereby grace have grace, and in heaven the joy everlasting. Now, for those of you who know the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, that is probably quite familiar language. And it's an indication that Cranmer, when writing the new prayer books in the reign of Edward VI, in fact, used a considerable amount of the Rite of Sarum. We think of the Reformation as having made a clean break with what had gone before, and that is not always the case. There is a very, very considerable amount of continuity, and here in the Liturgy of the Mass is an example of it. But moving on quickly, what else happened in the medieval church? Well, the sacraments were of vital importance. And there's an illustration there of one of them, which is that of penance, confession. I chose it because I like it hugely. There is a woman kneeling in front of a priest, and if you can see it, he's seated on his chair, and he appears, he's holding either a missal or possibly a penitential, one of the sort of guides to hearing penance that proliferated really from the 13th century onwards. And he's holding his head in his hands, either in consternation or horror. I really can't quite work out, or maybe he's trying to work out what exactly he should say to the woman and what penance he should give her. Confession and penance became more and more common in the medieval church after the Fourth Lateran Council, so the early 13th century. The Fourth Lateran Council decreed that actually people had to receive Holy Communion at least once a year at Easter. And you couldn't receive the Mass, you couldn't receive Holy Communion unless you had been to confession. And so most people would only receive communion once a year, receive the Eucharist once a year at Easter, and they would therefore go to confession during Lent. And many of them would actually leave making their confession until the last week in Lent, so they didn't have much time to sin between saying their confession and receiving the sacrament. There was a very real reverence for the Mass and a very real desire not to take communion unworthily. There was fear is the right word of that. And there are lots of examples of and descriptions of people queuing in Lent to be able to say confession. The book the priest might well be holding could be a penitential, which were the books that grew up to help priests, ordinary parish priests, hear confessions. Very often they were sort of structured around the 7 deadly sins. They also contained a lot of other practical pastoral advice for priests, and told them how they could respond to different types of sins. Other sacraments, of course, included baptism, which ever increasingly, once it became easy to get to your parish church, baptism would take place very, very soon after a child's birth, preferably on the day of birth. That's also obviously to do with the high death rate, high mortality rate at that time. The other sacraments were confirmation. Confirmation could only take place at the hands of a bishop, and so that people might have to wait a very, very long time in order to receive confirmation at the hands of a bishop. I remember reading the life of Hugh of Lincoln a number of years ago, and being very struck by records of people stopping Hugh of Lincoln, who lived in the early 13th century, by the side of the road and requesting confirmation from him as he rode past. It was so rare for a bishop to actually come to the parish church. People could wait a very long time before being confirmed. But the sacraments, again, like the Mass, were seen as effective conduits for God's grace. They were essential means whereby that sort of barrier between the divine, the heavenly, and the human realm were broken. They were channels for God's grace. And there was, of course, a real desire on believers' part, on the part of believers, to connect with the divine. And key to that were the saints. You were never, ever alone in the medieval church. You were surrounded by the saints. And this is something that was so much more vivid for them than it is, I think, for us, even if we come from a high church background and we're used to the veneration of the saints. Respect, veneration for the saints, they weren't worshipped technically, they were venerated, began in the very earliest days of the Christian church, and really resulted from the admiration, veneration that was given to the martyrs. We know in the catacombs in Rome, Christians, when they died, wanted to be buried as close as they possibly could to the burial places of the martyrs. And this veneration for people who had been examples of how to live the Christian faith developed very, very quickly. And the saints, by the late Middle Ages, were really regarded with tremendous affection, and they were approached with confidence. They were seen as friends. They weren't frightening. Kind neighbors and of our knowing is a quote. There was an affectionate dependence upon them. I think that's quoting Dermot McCulloch. They were people who'd lived the Christian life like us, and they had persevered. Actually, there are particular patterns of different saints. You can trace the history of the canonization of men and women through church history, and there are distinct fashions in, let's say, the 7th, 8th centuries, 9th centuries. Many of those canonized were bishops who had stood by and fought for the rights of individual people and communities, and stood up for them against kings and other powers who were taking away their rights. There are, of course, those virgin saints that were so popular in the Middle Ages, St. Catherine, St. Agatha, etc. Many of them died appalling deaths, which begs some very serious questions actually as to why those deaths were quite described in such quite gory terms. Many of the female saints were virgins, and virginity was seen as sort of demonstrating the power of the saint, in that she, particularly a woman, but sometimes a man, had withstood the wiles of the flesh and the devil. They were men and women who had genuinely persevered, unlike ordinary Christians, but they were approached with great affection. They existed to honor God, but also because they were now in heaven, when people approached them in intercession, they were seen as having a sort of treasury of merit, which by intercessory prayer, the petitioner could access. But they also celebrated the hope that lay in the Christian life, that the saints represented what might be possible for the ordinary Christian, and they were examples to follow. And interestingly, these changing patterns of sanctity and canonization, early saints tended to be ones who were renowned for their miracles, but later on in the Middle Ages, They became, their virtues became more and more important. But they were seen, as it were, as men and women who stood in the presence of God and whose prayers were particularly efficacious. And supreme among the saints was the Virgin Mary. And it's hard to underestimate her importance for the late medieval church. There would be statues of her in churches, obviously chapels, lady chapels devoted to her, frescoes of her. Here on the left is in fact an illuminated manuscript showing Mary as the Mother of Mercy. She became symbolic in the Middle Ages of the mercy and the grace of God, and she acquired innumerable symbolic associations. She was recognized and revered as the Queen of Heaven from the 10th century, and the anthem, the Regina Caeli, in fact, became widespread in the 10th century, and other anthems to her developed later. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, the idea that Mary, like Jesus, had been born sinless and not through any natural process, was always disputed in the Middle Ages. People like Bernard of Clairvaux, Aquinas thought it was absolute nonsense. But in the 13th century, Duns Scotus defended it. And for many people, it became a very particular way of understanding how very special and how different Mary was, and how appropriate it was for her to be the mother of the Saviour of the world. But you can see in artistic representations of her that her sweetness, her humility, her mercy comes to the foremost in the later Middle Ages. And there on the right is a lovely, lovely alabaster statue of Mary gazing at her, down at her child, and there is Christ gazing back at her, holding in his hand, you probably won't be able to see it very clearly, an apple representing, of course, the fall of mankind, which he was to redeem. But he redeemed mankind because of Mary's obedience, Mary's humility, Mary's yes to God. And of course, one of the prayers in the Middle Ages, which every Christian was taught to recite, was the Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. And that prayer began to be said at various times during the day, in the morning, in the evening, and at midday, and canticles were added to it, and it became the Angelus. And likewise, prayers remembering events, biblical and non-biblical, in the life of the Virgin, became an essential form of personal devotion in the Middle Ages with the development of the Rosary, which developed again in the sort of 13th century onwards. So the saints and the Blessed Virgin Mary, you were never alone in church in the Middle Ages. You were surrounded by this great company of heaven, which you saw as friends and regarded with considerable affection. And that brings us on to another key characteristic of religious life, traditional religious life in the late Middle Ages, and that's the praying for the dead. There grew up it seemed completely logical to people that there needed to be something between this faltering Christian life that so many people realized they lived on earth and the glory, the sanctity of heaven. How could it be that people could be transferred on the day of judgment straight from the sinful life that they had lived to the glory, the sanctity of heaven? And it became, and logically people thought that actually there ought to be, as it were, an interim stage where people could be made pure, could be made ready for heaven. And so gradually the doctrine of what was eventually called purgatory developed. Masses were being said for the dead by as early as the 9th century on side altars in churches. But prayers for the dead really proliferated, really from the 12th century onwards, and the very name purgatory develops in the 12th century. Purgatory had an end to it. It didn't go on forever. It would cease at the Last Judgment. But people would say prayers for the dead because the idea had grown up that masses and prayers for the dead would limit the amount of time that your relative, your friend, would have in purgatory. There are points at which it's possible to think of late medieval traditional devotion as being quite transactional. You could pray for the dead, and according to how many masses or how many prayers you said, as it were, certain amount of time will be remitted from purgatory. We'll see that in a moment as well with pilgrimage. But chantry chapels proliferated, grew up. This is the chantry chapel for Alistair Lepole at Ewelme in Oxfordshire, places where the rich could endow an altar, a chapel, and a priest to say masses for the dead. Linked to that is the sale of indulgences, which again, there is no biblical basis for this, but again, it was a logical development that if the Pope was Christ's vicar on earth and there was an endless sort of well of merit that could be dispensed because of Christ's bounty, then it would be mean on the Pope, for the Pope, to withhold this treasury from other Christians. Dermot MacCulloch puts it absolutely magnificently and slightly sarcastically in his book on the Reformation. And so from 1343 onward, Clement VI actually developed the idea of an indulgence whereby a person could buy a little bit of this treasury of merit, pay money for it, and it would remit again some time in purgatory. And it was seen as an act of generosity, as an act of mercy. From the point of view of church leaders at times, of course, it could be seen as a very useful way of raising funds. But saints, the cult of the saints leads us to the idea of pilgrimage, which again was vital. And again, it links to this idea of people wanting to access the divine, to be able in this human world, which for so many people was short and so very difficult, to be able to make contact with God himself and with the saints who dwelt in glory. And therefore the idea of pilgrimage developed, either to a place that was associated with the life of Christ, but actually that became very difficult once the Crusades were underway, or to a place that was associated with one of the saints. This is in fact a photograph of the shrine of St. Thomas Cantilupe in Hereford. The most famous site of pilgrimage in England was Canterbury for Thomas Becket, and people went on pilgrimage to pray at the shrine of the saint, very often with a particular petition if they'd been ill. And here is a picture from a photograph from Canterbury Cathedral of one of the stained glass windows depicting the miracles of St. Thomas. If you can see it, at the top half, there's St. Thomas, and he's sort of shooting out of his shrine. He's appearing in a dream to a man who's lying sick on the bed below. But there is St. Thomas, as it were, appearing from his shrine in order to be able to come and to the aid of this person. The miracles that occurred at the shrine of St. Thomas Becket were recorded by the monks there, and some of you may have been to the recent exhibition at the British Museum about St. Thomas Becket. But here is a photograph of a window at York Minster, which is the shrine of St. William of York. And if you can make it out, there's a man who seems to be sort of inserting a leg into the shrine. That leg would have been made of wax and hanging up, sort of almost like washing above the shrine, and other wax votive offerings. And what would happen at the shrine would be that people would offer representations of other people, or maybe parts of their own body that they wanted prayer for. So if you had something wrong with your hand or with your leg, you might have made a representation in wax. What has also been discovered, I think very, very movingly by some of these shrines, are fragments of female shifts, chemises. And these are probably remnants of votive offerings that were made by women coming to shrines to beg for the gift of a child. So pilgrimage and the intercession of the saints, a vital part of traditional religion in the Middle Ages. And my last slide in this section comes from, again, in fact, from a church in York. And it's the idea as well that traditional religion by the 15th century was very practical in many respects. And this is a window depicting the 7 works of mercy. Those acts of mercy which are depicted by Jesus in one of his parables, but which traditional religion sort of asked Christian people to follow the example that was set by Jesus Christ. But again, there was the idea that this would do you good in the long run, that not only were you following the example of the saints and obeying the teaching of Jesus Christ, but also in terms of remitting years in purgatory, of being effective in your salvation. There was something return for your works of mercy. But very, very quickly, because we're due to end in a few minutes, what was going on in people's minds? We've looked at what they did, but what was going on in people's minds? Well, it's extremely difficult to tell, because there are very few occasions where people actually wrote down what they were thinking. And then, of course, we can't necessarily trust it. One source that has been used a lot recently comes from religious art. And that is when in manuscripts or other paintings, we see both laity and clergy in a religious activity, but they appear to be contemplating not just an image, but something, as it were, that they're imagining. In other words, something that they're seeing in their mind's eye. And here we have an image of a priest in the celebration of the Mass, but there in front of him, in his mind's eye, is a depiction of Jesus Christ, the man of sorrows, with the instruments of the crucifixion around him. The wounds of Christ became a very real devotional activity in the late Middle Ages in traditional religion. It was the Franciscans who emphasized the human nature of Jesus. And earlier in Christian art, Jesus had been depicted as glorious and victorious, but from the 13th century onward, he's very often depicted as being someone who's suffering, a crucified, tortured man. And a lot of the interior devotion seems to have been imaginative, often inspired by an image, a painting, a statue, and people imagining and trying to enter into those sufferings that Christ suffered on their behalf. They would meditate on them and make those sufferings and try and make those sufferings real. And we know that people like Marjorie Kemp would weep, was moved to tears when contemplating the suffering of Jesus Christ. For lay people, there's an image from a Primo, one of the Hours of the Virgin, a wealthy, very, very wealthy woman reading a prayer book, in effect, which would have contained readings and associated with the Virgin Mary. And in the background, there is another image. She's got the book in her hand, but there's another image, as it were, showing what might have well have been going on in her head, in her mind's eye, as she's reading about the Virgin, she's praying the hours of the Virgin, and there is an image of the Virgin, and she is there venerating the Virgin. The Virgin, as it were, is becoming real to her in her imagination, in her mind, and it's very, very visual. Those of you who are managing to stay awake, I'm racing through my last couple of minutes, will have wondered, what about the Bible? I haven't mentioned the Bible so far at all. The Bible wasn't necessarily something that was found in a church in the Middle Ages. Many records exist of books that were found in churches, but the Bible was not very often among them. In fact, it's fairly rare. The Bible, of course, would have been in Latin until in 1382 Wycliffe published his New Testament. And it became fairly popular, but of course, it was only available as a complete book to those who were wealthy. It had to be copied by hand. And Wycliffe's followers became known as Lollards, and many heretical beliefs were associated with them, and they were condemned as heretics early in the 15th century. And therefore, the history of the English New Testament in England actually is, well, the vernacular New Testament in England actually is rather different to the history of the vernacular New Testament elsewhere in the country. People were allowed to read Wycliffe's New Testament translation in English in the 15th century, but they needed a license in order to do so. They needed permission, and that was only ever granted, A, if you could afford it, and B, if you were a person of right standing. So the reading of the Bible in English in the 15th century was circumscribed. Some prayers were taught in English, and various parts of the Mass increasingly were being said in English. But essentially, the New Testament was out of many people's reach unless they'd had contact at some point or another with the Lollards. And we know full well that they read their Bibles assiduously. Preaching. Very quickly, this is actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishop Arundel, preaching from a pulpit somewhere or other, and people sitting to listen to him, reminding us that in the medieval church, there weren't very many benches. There were benches along the walls, but people stood or they sat. They would kneel at various points. But preaching in an ordinary parish church would have been very limited. It was popular, sermons were preached by the friars. The Dominicans are, of course, the order of preachers, and lots of examples of their sermons exist. Some of them are very fanciful, not all of them, but they're certainly not quite sermons as we regard them now. If you're interested, there are lots of examples that you are able to read. But what about reform? Many of us will have learnt from school that there was pressure on the late medieval church on religion, on traditional religion, and that there was this phenomenon of anti-clericalism caused in part by lack of education for the clergy, by the practice of people holding more than one benefice, pluralism, the practice of senior clergy appointing very unsuitable priests into parishes and elsewhere, simony. Now, we need to be quite careful of a lot of this. A lot of the evidence comes either from Protestant propagandists later on in the Reformation, or alternatively, some of it from sort of groups of people with very particular interests. For instance, there's quite a lot of anti-clericalism from London merchants, which was in fact directed against Wolsey. And it was really more a case of them wanting more freedom in their mercantile affairs than anything religious. So quite a lot of the perception of anti-clericalism in the 15th century has in fact changed in recent years. And I mentioned the fact that the parish clergy were not were often well regarded and well liked. That cartoon there, that woodcut, is of a friar as a fox out to deceive the people. But one of the great pressures for reform comes from the new learning associated with the Renaissance. And I'm going to end with a picture of the great humanist scholar Erasmus. This is painted by Holbein. Erasmus published his Greek New Testament in 1516. He'd gone back to the sources, ad fontes, to those original sources for the New Testament, for the beginnings of Christianity. It needs to be said he wasn't the only person doing this. There were many other scholars involved in similar work at the time, but Erasmus managed to get his Greek New Testament out very quickly. And it was to have a profound effect. Ever since Jerome, in the Latin West, the Bible had understandably been read in the Vulgate. And Erasmus translated the New Testament back into Latin, but from his Greek New Testament. And what it did was to show that very possibly the late medieval traditional understanding of certain key doctrines supposedly derived from the scriptures were wrong. And a classic example is one I've mentioned earlier, the Hail Mary, Ave Maria, plena gratia. That was taken by many people completely literally. The Mary was a vessel, sort of literally filled up with God's grace, and it overflowed. She had this great treasury that overflowed to other people. Erasmus's translation of the Greek showed that the Greek actually said something slightly different. It didn't say, Hail Mary, full of grace. It actually said, Hail Mary, favored one. And that's a very different understanding of the Virgin Mary. And it's work like this that begins to lay the seeds for later scholars, and particularly for the reformers on the continent. But there were other pressures in the 15th century on the church as well, huge administrative pressures, and a great desire to see change, to see increased education, to see reform. And in fact, many of the bishops in England at the end of the 15th century were heavily involved in the administrative reform of their dioceses. They weren't lazy. They were trying very hard to make the Christian life more effective and easier to communicate to people. So I'm going to stop there, I'm afraid, having romped through a huge amount about traditional religion in the Middle Ages. I hope it's set a picture for you. I know we've run over, I'm sorry about that. If you want to email me with some questions, please do email me, preferably using my Chichester address. I will come into the chat function now, and actually this, if you want to ask me, write in the chat function, do, and I will email you back. But I hope this has given you, as it were, laid the scene for the church in the 15th century. And I hope those of you who know the Church of England well will already have seen in the picture I've painted things that you recognise, but also things that are very different. So I look forward to hearing from you if you want to communicate with me, and otherwise I look forward to seeing you greatly next week. And I'm sorry I've run over. Next week is going to be different. There'll be less material and more opportunities for you to be able to talk among yourselves and actually communicate with me. But thank you very, very much, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. I have now read the chat shop and I am going to close this down. So no more people are scribbling things. This has been recorded and we will put it up on the website. So good night, everybody, and sleep well. Look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.